Hello, everybody. So, Jim Bob has been making the rounds lately in the evolution debate space. He even recently got a PhD biologist to debate the topic, and since the time of writing the script, he's even gotten the attention of Professor Dave. Those who are familiar with his style will know that he likes to center the topic around philosophy of science. Specifically, how do you set up an experiment? How do you justify scientific claims? Which epistemic tools are you using? And what presuppositions are you using in order to use them? I think it's actually funny that he says his strategy is to take things to the granular level, because he can debate a PhD biologist who will have a highly granular and academically correct description of mutations in natural selection, and yet the real tension in the debate always goes the same place it does with amateur opponents. These are issues of what is arbitrary versus objective, up to and including the criteria you are using for discriminating between the so-called granular processes a biologist would want to talk about. So, Jim Bob hosts a call-in show recently, and I'm thinking to myself, alright, this debate is about what counts as a distinction and why you can make that distinction if everything has a common ancestor. The question goes, if something is becoming not the common ancestor anymore, what criteria do you use to determine when it's not? So I was thinking, okay, I see what you're trying to say. I can answer that. Let me come up with an analogy that exposes where we differ on our accounts of the entailments of evolution on the distinctions between clades. Now that's sort of what happened, except instead we expose where the analogy I used, the tree of life, reveals a deeper understanding of why he's pointing to the problem that he is. If you are going to bother entering a philosophy of science debate, which is what this debate space he's in is, then pay attention, because I'm going to explain to you why you never get to talk about the granular biology you want to talk about. In order to illustrate this, the YouTube comments section has graciously provided me with the material to set this up. The thing in question is, what are the criteria for determining when a clade begins? The implication, of course, is a denial that you can know that. So this commenter responds, wouldn't this be using an epistemological critique to justify an ontological claim, and therefore a category error? Even if I grant that you can't know when a clade begins, how does that disprove that a process called evolution is happening objectively? Now to the commenter, this is a very tempting question in response, and it's not an unintelligent question, but the problem, at least the main problem, is not whether clades form in a black box that you can't observe. Jim Bob is making the claim that you don't even have the criteria to say what's happening inside the black box, even if you could theoretically peek inside it. When I was asked on stream what the criteria are, I skipped a step. I argued that a clade can be distinguished like branches on a tree, where each branch has a unique connection of nodes to the trunk, which is unidentical to the other branches by at least one node. So then he goes, okay, but I can see when a new branch begins on a tree, and it's still a part of the nature of the tree, so how do you know when a new clade begins? The problem I ran into with this is I think the same thing Jim Bob would say to this commenter, which is, if you're going to make this analogy, then you need to reconcile the following. If one clade is not identical to another one, then it has a different nature. If instead all clades are just variations on the same nature, then the distinction you want to make with clades appeals to that nature. Re-listen to that if you have to. Either all clades have the same nature and distinctions are merely nominal, or you still need criteria for when a universal identity can no longer be said to be the same as a prior iteration, all while maintaining that each prior identity you appeal to also has a distinct nature, which is not just a subcategory of the supposed one true nature. You might instead argue that the tree analogy is merely illustrative and not actually explaining what is evolving. But in light of this discussion, I would actually argue that there is no better analogy which would not beg the question I was attempting to resolve with it. Let's do one example. Some people argue that biological evolution is more analogous to the way that languages change over time. They say a mutation is like a letter or a word getting swapped out for another. The problem with this is, to grant the ontology you are assigning to words would be to grant the claim of evolution which was in question in the tree analogy. There can be no analogy to evolution which is not itself just a description of evolution in other terms. Where you would want to say that the letters of DNA are like the letters of a language, and mutation is replacing them with different letters, Your opponent would say that the meaning or nature of a word maintains its identity over time, and distinctions between languages are merely nominal. What is changing is the reference, not the referent. Let's first return to the comments, which have provided an attempt to reconcile these problems. This says that a new clade occurs whenever an organism has offspring. In the words of what I think the opponent would say, this commenter is introducing the idea of every individual as their own category. In order to resolve the criteria for clades, I would agree this is a necessary but incomplete part of the solution. The challenge is, if these individuals all derive from a common ancestor, then that ancestry is still a category which must be taken into account. If there really is something called a human, that must still appeal to a prior non-human ancestry as a category that needs justification. If there's nothing that's really human, then you're back to nominalism. The commenter continues. Question 1. Do I recognize these different clades as identifiable and distinguishable, or am I just now pretending not to understand anything for the sake of making arguments for my video? Well, the opponent would, of course, grant that you can categorize things taxonomically. That's not the thing in question. He continues. 2. Can I pinpoint the de facto common ancestors of any of the clades and subclades? Now that is the thing in question, and I'll come back to that. 3. Does my inability to identify said de facto direct ancestors of the clades imply that the plants aren't, can't, or no longer related through common ancestry? Alright, setting aside that your ability to do taxonomy is irrelevant here, the challenge is to have criteria for what the plant ancestor you're appealing to is, and when it becomes no longer what it was. You're not being asked if you can do taxonomy. You're being asked what is universal about the ancestry you're appealing to if some clades are not others, but they are all related. And again, if you don't care about the question because it's philosophy, then I'm sorry, you're in the wrong place. Stop wasting your time here. Question 4. If I dismiss standard practices of relationship reconstruct, am I able to reconstruct the relationships myself? And can I honestly answer questions like, are two turnips more closely related to each other than turnips are to Chinese cabbage? Again, your ability to identify hierarchies of similarity and construct a taxonomy of relatedness is not the thing in question. I'm only trying to help you steelman Jim Bob here. Let's return to question 2. Can I pinpoint the de facto common ancestors of any of the clades and subclades? And to add to your question, if every individual is a clade, what even is a common ancestor? To answer this, first, some premises. 1. All individuals are unique. Therefore, replication entails heritable variation, and this we'll call mutation. 2. Replicators do not populate or reproduce equally, and this we'll call selection. 3. If a population consists of a group of replicators, then mutation and selection are preconditions for populations. Given these premises, now consider what a clade could be. If it is a universal, then it must be multiply instantiable, repeatable across time and space, and independent of particular histories. To qualify as a universal, a clade must have the same nature in multiple instances. The mistake I made in the call was to compare the tree of life to an ancestor as a universal category, thus logically trapping myself in the denial of the distinctions between clades. Ancestry is non-repeatable and fixed temporally. Even direct parentage is not instantiable in multiple places or times. Therefore, common ancestry is not a universal in the philosophical sense. It is instead a particular history. While an ontological clade is defined per individual, a taxonomic clade is referring to the history of a particular lineage. If select individuals share a common ancestor, then they are all related by a non-repeatable lineage descended from that particular ancestor. The following then is my argument for how a taxonomic clade can be objective without collapsing evolution into nominalism. Premise 1. Replication with inheritance is the mechanism by which historical continuity between organisms exists. Premise 2. Inheritance constrains historical continuity by establishing descent relations only between organisms connected via replication. Premise 3. Where no inherited continuity exists between lineages, no descent relation exists between them. Conclusion. Therefore, descent relations are constrained objectively by inheritance. Premise 4. Taxonomic clades are defined by descent relations. Conclusion. Therefore, taxonomic clades can be discriminated objectively. Now, I understand that these will need supporting arguments. I think the opponent would grant that if it were the case that what we are calling ancestries are subsets of a universal, such as a created human, this would be no problem. Different ancestries, different variations on a universal nature. Under a common descent, however, what is that particular ancestor and what is it not? How, for example, could you point to a human ancestor and say that it's not a human, but at some point its descendants are? The concept we need is called fixation, the population-level divergence that gives a taxonomic clade its identity. If populations presuppose mutation and selection, evolutionary mechanisms, then this grounds both the ontological and taxonomic definitions of clades for a few reasons. If populations entail replication and thus inheritance, then related individuals will have inherited some of the same traits. If selection refers to the unequal reproduction of those traits, then some traits common to related individuals will not have been inherited by others. Inherent variance is thus unequal at the level of the ontological clade. On the basis that some inherent variance is historically constrained, some ancestral relations are therefore impossible. When inherent variance becomes common and historically constrained to a lineage such that some ancestral relations are possible while others are impossible, that is referred to as fixation, and that is when a new taxonomic clade begins. If, for example, what we refer to as dogs represent a lineage, then the heritable traits that they all have in common must also have been possessed by their common ancestor at the ontological clade level. The traits that only dogs have, though, must not have been inherited by anything that isn't a dog. This means if there is any lineage whose exclusively common traits share no overlap with the exclusively common traits for dogs, then it is impossible for that lineage to be descended from dogs. That could only be the case if lineages are objectively real, which they would be if the mechanisms of replication that I call evolution are the precondition for populations. If you made it this far, thank you very much for watching, and I look forward to the discussion that follows.